Consumed by the desire for revenge against the warrior who destroyed her life, she never imagined that the only way to save her own soul would be to betray her people to protect the children of her greatest enemy. If stories about the power of empathy to break down the deepest hatred resonate with you, subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. The Chihuahuan desert sun of 1880 was a silent and relentless witness to desolation. Beneath its scorching glare, Isabela knelt on the earth that was the tomb of her life. The ashes of her family's hacienda, a legacy built with sweat and blood for generations, stained her hands and her dress, mingling with the dried tears on her face. The smell of burnt wood and lost dreams still lingered in the air, a suffocating ghost. In her mind, one image repeated in a torturous loop, the face of the Apache leader, his features as hard as the rocks of the Sierra Madre, commanding the fury that had taken her husband, her home, and her future. There, amid the rubble of her existence, she raised her eyes to the distant peaks, and a venomous oath burst from her cracked lips. A whisper carried by the wind like a plague. She would hunt him down and make him pay with his life. Isabela was no frail maiden. In her early 20s, her shoulders bore the weight of a life forged on the frontier, where resilience was as vital as water. Her skin, tanned by the relentless sun, and her hands, calloused from hard work, told the story of a woman whose identity was fused with that land. For her, the world was divided by a clear, bloody line. On one side, her people, the Mexicans who tamed the wild landscape. On the other, the Apache, the ND, whom she had been taught to see as savage specters, soulless demons that haunted the Sierras. This belief was the foundation of her reality, now shattered. Her greatest weakness was not grief, but the hatred it gave birth to, a blind, visceral rage that consumed her, preventing her from seeing any trace of humanity in those she blamed for her ruin. The land Isabela called home was a burning frontier. In northern Mexico, at the foot of the imposing Sierra Madre, the air vibrated with the tension of the Apache Wars. It was not a place for the faint of heart. Here, the Mexican government and settlers waged a war of extermination against the tribes who considered this land sacred, a battlefield where life was worth little and death a constant companion. The dust of the long, dry seasons rose with the galloping of soldiers' horses and the silent footsteps of warriors. Distrust was the universal language, spoken in cautious whispers on the ranches and in war cries in the canyons. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every distant campfire a bad omen. Violence was not an event, but the very fabric of existence, a cycle of bloody retaliation that poisoned everyone without distinction. Driven by a fury that was the only thing keeping her going, Isabela began her blind quest for revenge. Her plan was rudimentary, born of desperation: find the trail of Nakia's band and bring the information to the army. However, the desert does not forgive recklessness. Her solitary journey led her straight into a trap, and she found herself captured by the very tribe she had cursed. The irony was cruel. The external conflict, her struggle to escape and exact her revenge, quickly became secondary. The real war began to rage within her soul, a devastating internal conflict. Forced to live with her captors, she found herself confronted with a reality her mind refused to accept. With each passing day, the moral certainty that fueled her began to disintegrate, corroded by the dissonance between the monster she had sworn to kill and the one she was beginning to see. In the early days of her captivity, Isabela's hatred was a fire she zealously fed. She was no passive prisoner, she was a saboteur. With discreet, calculated gestures, she attempted to contaminate the water, spoil the dry food supplies, and frighten the horses. Each act was a small victory in her private war, a silent tribute to her dead husband. Yet her actions did not provoke the violent reaction she expected. There was no torture, no threats. Instead, Her hostility was met with an almost contemptuous indifference, a pragmatic vigilance that disarmed her. The women watched her with watchful, weary eyes. The warriors simply ignored her, and the children skirted her as if she were a strange rock in the path. This lack of engagement with her hatred was more maddening than any punishment, for it forced her to confront the emptiness of her own fury. The first crack in her wall of hatred appeared on a cold, clear night, beneath a blanket of stars that seemed to mock her misery. Hidden in the shadows, far from the glow of the central fire, Isabela watched Nakia. He was not the fierce warrior of that fateful day, but a father. Sitting on the dirt floor, his 2 young children nestled against him. His voice was a low, steady murmur. He pointed to the sky, tracing with his finger the same constellations her father had used to teach her about celestial hunters and sacred animals. He told stories not of war and blood, but of ancient heroes and the wisdom of the coyote. In that instant, the image of the savage she had so fiercely guarded shattered. She saw the same tenderness, the same universal love she had known, and for the first time, the ache in her chest was not just her own. It was an echo of their shared humanity. Isabela's courage in beginning to see beyond her pain is what inspires us. If you also feel the power of this transformation, show your support by leaving a comment. And to not miss a step of this and other incredible journeys of overcoming, be sure to subscribe to the channel. A few weeks later, a treacherous fever crept over the camp, silent and lethal as a desert serpent. One of Nakia's daughters, little Nita, burned with delirium, her frail body trembling uncontrollably. The tribe's healer, an elder named Tashunki, did what she could with her rituals and herbs, but the child seemed to be wasting away. Watching from afar, Isabela felt a sharp conflict. The girl was her enemy's daughter, but her moans of pain pierced the barrier of hatred. In her feverish eyes, she saw not an Apache, but merely a suffering child. Remembering her grandmother's teachings, Isabela ventured into the bush, searching for a specific route she knew to be effective in lowering fever. Hesitantly, she prepared the infusion and offered it to the women. It was an act of mercy that created a tenuous, silent bridge across the chasm of distrust that separated them. Tashunka, the elder, was a figure who seemed sculpted by the earth itself. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, and her eyes held the wisdom of countless seasons. She spoke no Spanish, but her communication with Isabela became the most profound of all. After the fever episode, the old healer began to reach out to Isabela, not with words but with gestures. She took her on silent walks, showing her plants that healed and others that killed. With her palm flat on the earth, she taught soundlessly that this ground was not a possession, but a living being, the mother of them all. Through Tashunke, Isabela began to understand Apache cosmology, a worldview that contrasted sharply with the notion of fences and property titles that defined their culture. The land belonged to no one. They belonged unto the land. As time passed, Isabela's image of Nakia continued to change. She saw him lead his warriors with unquestionable authority, a cunning strategist whose presence commanded respect and fear in his enemies. Yet she also witnessed another side of this man. She saw the widowed father whose shoulders bore not only the fate of his tribe, but also the weight of raising 2 children in a world that wanted to annihilate them. He was a distorted mirror of her own losses. The fierce dedication with which he protected and taught his children reflected the love she had felt for her own family. That warrior, the monster of her memories, was, at his core, a man fighting to protect the future that resided in the eyes of his children. This realization was a painful blow to her vow of revenge, for it made it impossible to hate him without hating a part of herself. The final revelation, the one that would demolish the last pillars of her hatred, came one night when the warriors returned from a patrol. Their voices were low, thick with fresh pain. Hidden, Isabela managed to make out fragments of their conversation in rudimentary Spanish, laced with Ande words. They spoke of a sacred site, a stream where her women and children had been ambushed by Mexican soldiers weeks before. A cowardly, dishonorable massacre. The dates aligned in her mind with terrifying clarity. The attack on her farm had not been a random act of savagery. It had been retaliation, an eye for an eye, pain for pain. Her personal narrative, the simple story of an innocent victim against barbaric aggressors, crumbled completely. She was not just a victim. She was a piece on a chessboard of mutual violence, where the line between the just and the monstrous was as fickle as the desert sand. Far from the Apache camp in the dusty Mexican army fort, Captain Morales represented the other side of that war. For him, the conflict was not a matter of land or revenge, but of progress and cleansing. He was a man of cold ambition, whose cruelty was masked by a veneer of pragmatism and patriotic duty. He saw the Apache not as a people, but as a plague to be eradicated so that civilization could flourish in the desert. On his maps, the sacred mountains of the Ande were mere strategic obstacles, and their lives were insignificant statistics in his reports. Morales was the embodiment of institutionalized dehumanization, a man for whom the annihilation of women and children was not a massacre, but an effective military tactic to break the enemy's spirit. He was the true antagonist of that land, a monster far more terrifying than any Apache warrior Isabela had ever imagined. Through relentless scouts and the torture of a captured hunter, Captain Morales finally obtained what he so desperately desired, the exact location of Nakia's camp. For him, it was the culmination of months of pursuit, the opportunity to deliver a final, decisive blow. The news was greeted with a cold glint in his eyes. Immediately, he began planning the attack, moving his troops under the cover of darkness with deadly precision. The strategy was simple and brutal. Surround the camp while they slept and attack at dawn. When the first light of the sun made every fleeing figure an easy target, there would be no prisoners, no mercy. The goal was total extermination, a massacre that would serve as an example and forever silence Apache resistance in that region. A storm of steel and fire was gathering on the horizon, ready to descend upon the sleeping families. That night, an unnatural stillness descended upon the Sierra. The nocturnal animals seemed silent, and the wind whispered omens that only a divided heart like Isabela's could interpret. Her experience as a daughter of the frontier had taught her to read the signs of danger in a way that the Apaches, focused on their own sentries, might not. She knew how the army moved, the silent discipline of their night marches, the way they used the terrain to their advantage. Observing the disposition of the few Apache sentries, she understood, with a clarity that chilled her blood, the fatal vulnerability of the camp. She saw the siege closing in her mind, could visualize the soldiers' positions, the firing line that would form with the first rays of sunlight. It was a terrifying knowledge, a lucidity that made her the only person in all that vast desert who grasped the true scale of the annihilation to come. Knowledge became torture, and the night stretched like an endless purgatory. Isabela found herself at the epicenter of an impossible dilemma, a moral crossroads that would define her soul forever. One path was silence. To remain in her hammock, close her eyes, and let the dawn bring the revenge she had once so longed for. It would be the end of Nakia and her tribe, payment for her husband's blood, and the destruction of her farm. The other path was betrayal. To run to Nakia, warn him of the deadly trap, and give them a chance to fight, to escape. It would mean betraying her own people, her blood, her identity. It would risk her own life, being forever branded a renegade. On one side, loyalty to her past and her oath. On the other, protection of the children whose faces she now knew. The woman who taught her about the land, and the man she finally understood. As the moon began its final descent, the image that assaulted Isabela's mind was not that of her fallen husband, nor that of her burning farm. It was the face of little Nita, fast asleep, her chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the shroud of darkness preparing to envelop her. She saw her brother, nestled beside their father, trusting in the protection that might be gone in a few hours. In that moment, revenge revealed itself for what it truly was, an empty thirst that could only be quenched with the blood of innocence. The hatred that had driven her for so long finally dissolved, not in forgiveness, but in an overwhelming realization that pain was a vicious cycle, and she had the power to break it. Humanity, she realized, was not a matter of people or tribe, but of choice. And she chose. Loyalty to her hatred died, so that loyalty to life could be born. With the decision made, a chill of purpose ran through her body. The fear was still there, an icy knot in her stomach, but it no longer paralyzed her. She moved from the shadows with the silent agility that life on the frontier had taught her. Each step was calculated, each shadow an ally. The camp slept, a cluster of soft breaths and fragile dreams. The greatest immediate danger was being spotted by an Apache sentry and mistaken for a threat, an arrow to her heart before she could utter a single word. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a war drum against the silence of the night. She needed to reach Nakia, the leader, the only one who could understand and act quickly enough. Racing against time, against the first thread of pale light that would soon announce the massacre on the horizon, Isabela became a traitor to save a family. She found him near the dying fire, a solitary figure watching over the sleep of his people. As he approached, Nakia turned, her hand instinctively on the hilt of her knife. Her eyes narrowed, distrust etched in every line of her face. Isabela's words came out in a feverish, desperate whisper, a mixture of Spanish and frantic gestures. She described the siege tactics, the dawn attack, Captain Morales's plan for extermination. At first, he stared at her with stony hardness, seeing in her only the captive, the enemy, the potential bait for an even more ingenious trap. But there was no mistaking the pallor of her face, the genuine terror that dilated her pupils. She spoke not like a spy, but like someone who had seen death firsthand. The precision of her details about Mexican military tactics was irrefutable, and in her eyes he saw not the hatred of before, but the reflection of love for his own children. He believed her. Nakia's reaction was instantaneous and decisive, a single low command, a whistle that cut through the night, and the camp awoke from its vulnerable slumber. There was no panic, no screams that might echo through the canyons and alert the soldiers. Instead, a wave of quiet, urgent activity swept through the place. It was the discipline of a people accustomed to flight, to survival. The women moved with a somber grace, scooping up their drowsy children, strapping them to their backs, and gathering their most essential belongings in seconds. The warriors grabbed their weapons, not to fight a losing battle, but to cover the retreat, to become a shield between their families and the approaching death. In less time than Isabela would have thought possible, the camp was being dismantled, transforming into shadows, preparing to merge with the darkness, a human tide retreating before the impending storm. As the tribe crept through a narrow gorge, a goat path that was their only escape route, the first rays of sunlight touched the peaks of the Sierra Madre. The grey, ghostly light revealed the truth of Isabela's warning. Down in the valley, the dark figures of Mexican soldiers moved, closing the noose of the trap. A chill ran down everyone's spine. The escape became a desperate race against the light. The sound of gravel rolling underfoot seemed loud as thunder in their ears. The children, now fully awake, muffled their cries against their mother's shoulders. Isabela ran with them, air burning her lungs, driven by adrenaline and terror. She was no longer a prisoner nor a stranger. She was part of this frenzied exodus, her fate now inextricably linked to that of the people she had come to destroy. The roar of guns echoed through the mountains, a brutal sound that tore through the peace of dawn. Captain Morales, furious to find the camp nearly deserted, ordered his men to open fire on the shadows fleeing down the slopes. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, tearing away shards of stone and lives. The attack, though thwarted in its primary objective, was not without casualties. Screams of pain mingled with the echoes of gunfire. A young warrior covering the rearguard fell, and an older woman, too slow, was struck. From her higher vantage point, Isabela looked back and witnessed the horror with a heavy heart. Revenge, she saw, was ugly, chaotic, and indiscriminate. It was not the poetic justice she had imagined, but a hail of lead that made no distinction between warriors and grandmothers. That sound, the sound of violence she herself had almost allowed, would be etched in her memory forever. Hours later, exhausted and wounded, the surviving Nakia people found refuge in a cave hidden behind a curtain of water, a sanctuary known only to their elders. The sound of the waterfall drowned out the cries of those mourning their losses and masked their fear of the future. The adrenaline of escape gave way to a heavy exhaustion and silent grief. Amid the grieving tribe, Isabela's position was a vacuum. She was no longer the prisoner, the enemy. The contempt in her eyes had been replaced by grudging respect. Yet neither was she one of them. The women tended their wounded, the men planned their next move, and she remained on the sidelines, a solitary figure caught between two worlds belonging to neither. The act that had saved their lives had also condemned her to perpetual exile, an isolation deeper than any physical captivity. At dusk, Nakia approached her. There were no words of thanks, for gratitude was a luxury amidst so much grief. Instead, he handed her a canteen of water and a piece of dried meat, a gesture of recognition that transcended language. In his eyes, Isabela saw a tacit understanding of the life debt he now owed her, but also the harsh reality of her situation. He told her, in a grave voice, that she was free to go. Yet they both knew what that freedom meant. Returning to the Mexican world was impossible. To Captain Morales and his people, she was a traitor of the worst kind, whose fate would be the gallows or a bullet. Her choice to save her family from her enemy had torn her from her very roots, leaving her adrift in a land that no longer recognized her as its daughter. Isabela never again saw the land she once called her own. The title deed, the piece of paper her family fought and died for, became irrelevant, a relic of a past life. The hacienda was eventually swallowed by another, and her name, if remembered at all, was whispered with contempt. The story of a woman who allied herself with the savages. Her new home became the frontier itself, the arid, lawless lands that separated the two peoples. She learned to live as the Apache had taught her, not in a fixed place, but in harmony with the earth's cycles, drawing sustenance from the same plants Tashunka had shown her. She became a phantom figure, a legend whispered in Mexican forts and Apache camps alike, the white woman who walked alone, belonging only to the dust and wind of the desert. In this solitude, however, Isabela found a freedom she had never known. By losing everything, her home, her people, her thirst for revenge, she freed herself from the crushing weight of hatred. The fire that had consumed her for so long finally died, leaving behind not a void, but a melancholy serenity. She learned that the world was not black and white, that heroes and monsters were often the same person seen from different angles. Riding through the vast landscapes of Chihuahua, she no longer saw a land to be possessed, but a home for all, large enough to hold even the most irreconcilable pain. Her journey did not restore what she had lost, but gave her something infinitely more valuable, the peace of a soul that had learned to forgive, not its enemies, but itself. Years passed, transforming the young widow into a woman whose face, like Tashunka's, began to map her journeys. One afternoon, sheltered under the shade of a gnarled mesquite, She watched a golden eagle teaching her chicks to fly. With fierce patience, the mother bird nudged the chicks to the edge of the nest, forcing them to rely on still trembling wings, circling protectively below to ensure they didn't fall onto the rocks. In that spectacle of nature, Isabela saw the perfect reflection of Nakia under the stars, of her own father's love, of her mother's devotion. The language of parental love, she fully understood, was the fundamental grammar of the world, spoken by all creatures, everywhere. It was the only truth that endured borders, wars, and time, the force that had driven her to betray an oath to honor a much older and more sacred value. The land, once an object of possession and a source of war, became her confidant and teacher. She learned to predict rain by the smell of creosote in the air, to find water by following the flight of birds, and to read the stories written in rocks and sand. Every canyon, every plain, every distant mountain became an acquaintance, a silent friend. This communion with the desert filled the void left by human society. The Mexicans saw her as a frightening legend, the Apache as a wandering spirit worthy of respect from afar. She sought refuge on neither side, finding her place in the space between. The land did not judge her for her past, did not question her loyalty. It simply welcomed her, offering sustenance and solitude that together healed the wounds that neither time nor revenge could have touched. Occasionally, her lonely path crossed the vestiges of the world she had abandoned. Once, from atop a rocky plateau, she watched a Mexican army patrol moving slowly through the valley below, a serpent of blue uniforms and steel gleaming in the sun. Years before, the sight would have stirred a whirlwind of emotions, anger, fear, perhaps a remnant of loyalty. Now she felt only a deep, distant sadness. They were boys, most of them, with young, frightened faces, trapped in the same cycle of obedience and violence that had taken her husband and nearly annihilated Nakia's children. Another time, she saw Apache hunters moving like spirits across the opposite slope. They saw her too, a solitary figure against the sky. There was a moment of hesitation, a silent recognition before both sides continued on their way, respecting an invisible boundary that she herself embodied. The word home, which once meant adobe walls, plowed fields, and the warmth of a hearth, dissolved and reassembled itself in her mind. What was home when the earth beneath her feet was contested and the blood of her loved ones had stained it? She understood that home was not a place on a map, but a place in the soul. Her home became the silence of desert dawns, the warmth of the sun on her back, the feel of her horse moving beneath her. It was the freedom of not having to hate anyone, the peace of no longer carrying the banner of any cause except that of survival and quiet compassion. By abandoning the search for a piece of land to call her own, she found a sense of belonging across the vast, unforgiving territory, becoming, in a way, more master of this land than anyone who claimed it with fences and guns. On particularly clear nights, when the constellations Nakia and her father showed her seemed within reach, Isabela thought of the children. She never knew what happened to Nita or her brother, whether they survived the disease, famine, and endless wars that followed. This uncertainty was a constant ache, an unanswered question carried by the desert wind, yet she learned to live with it. Her sacrifice was not a transaction. She did not do it for gratitude or to witness a happy ending. It was a payment, a discharge of the debt all human beings owe one another. In her heart she held the silent hope that somewhere under that same starry sky, a new generation was growing up, carrying the stories and the future of her people, a future that she, the enemy, had helped to secure. She knew how stories were told in the forts and villages, the mad widow, the renegade, the woman who shamed her husband's memory. She could also imagine the whispered stories among the Apache, the strange Mexican woman who warned them on the night of the massacre. In neither version was she the heroine. Her true story, with all its painful complexity, existed only within her. Isabela accepted her fate of becoming a ghost in the narratives of both peoples. Her legacy would not be a song or a monument, but something much more real and anonymous, the continuation of a lineage, the laughter of children who never knew her, the silence of a massacre that never happened. She understood that the most important acts are rarely remembered, but their echoes, like ripples on water, spread far beyond their point of origin. Time, like the river that cuts through the canyon, continued its course, slowly eroding the edges of that wild land. From her isolated vantage point, Isabela witnessed the changes that arrived with the dust of caravans and the distant whistle of the first trains. More settlers arrived, ploughing the land with a tenacity she knew well, erecting barbed wire fences that cut through the old hunting routes like scars. Wars, though still erupting in spasms of violence, were waning. Apache resistance gradually crushed under the weight of numbers and technology. To the newcomers, she was just part of the landscape, a strange and anachronistic figure. Isabela watched it all with the serenity of someone no longer part of that struggle, a spectator at the end of an era, cherishing the memory of a time when the land and its people were more untamable. She, who once believed strength resided in the tip of a knife or in the oath of eternal hatred, learned a deeper lesson in the mountains. True strength, she discovered, lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to protect. It was not blind loyalty to a people, but the ability to recognize the humanity in a perceived enemy. Her greatest test of bravery was not facing an Apache warrior, but facing herself, her own prejudice, her own pain. Resilience, she realized, was not about never falling, but about finding a reason to rise, even when everything she loved had turned to ash. This knowledge was her only treasure, a wisdom forged in fire that made her stronger than any soldier or warrior still fighting for pieces of land. As the seasons passed, Isabela's body began to register the passage of time. Her hair, once black as obsidian, grew strands of silver like the frost that covered the desert on winter mornings. One day, her journey took her to a hill overlooking the valley where her old life lay buried. From afar, she saw the new farm, smoke rising from a chimney that wasn't hers, cattle grazing in fields that had once been hers. She felt neither the sharp pang of loss nor the heat of anger. She felt only a vast distance, as if observing someone else's life. She nodded silently to the hate-filled young woman who had once knelt in those ashes, acknowledging her not with shame, but with tender compassion. That place was no longer a tomb, but a starting point, the cradle of her true, painful life. She never had children. The life she had imagined for herself, with children's laughter filling an adobe house, had been one of the first things to burn, along with the farm. Yet, in her solitude, she felt connected to a universal motherhood. In protecting Nakia's children, she had acted with the same protective instinct her own mother would have felt for her. Love, she believed, needed no blood ties to exist. It was born from recognizing a spark of self in another. That solitary act of betrayal and humanity became her legacy, her invisible children. By renouncing her revenge, she gave birth to the possibility of a future for others, and in that understanding, she found a form of peace with the fate that had been denied her. Nakia is path again. He remained in her memory not as the monster she swore to kill, nor as the hero she saved, but as her equal. A man forged by the same harsh land, who loved his children as fiercely as she would have loved hers, and who carried the weight of a people on his shoulders. He was living proof that the stories we tell ourselves about our enemies are the most dangerous of fictions. In her memory, Nakia became less a man and more a symbol of the stubborn dignity of a people who refused to disappear, a mirror that forced her to confront her own soul and find something truer than revenge. He was the catalyst that broke her, but also the one that allowed her to remake herself into something much stronger and more complete. The concept of forgiveness became complex and ultimately irrelevant to Isabela. How could she forgive Nakia for retaliation without first asking for forgiveness for the massacre that provoked it? How could either of them forgive the other when both were products of a cycle of violence that began long before they were born? She realized that seeking forgiveness was just another way of keeping track of mistakes and debts. True peace came not from forgiveness, but from transcendence. It came from the radical acceptance that pain was the common heritage of this land, and that the only sensible response was not to justify one side, but to grieve for all. By releasing the bonds of judgment, she finally freed herself from the obligation to hate, making room for a compassion that required neither explanation nor apology. In her final years, Isabela found a permanent haven in a small, sheltered valley where a stubborn spring gave life to a grove of poplars. There, she lived out her days, no longer a fugitive, but an integral part of the landscape. The desert animals grew accustomed to her quiet presence, and travelers who chanced upon her spoke of a hermit whose eyes held the vastness of the sky itself. She no longer felt the weight of loneliness, for she had discovered the difference between being alone and being at peace. The world continued its noisy march of progress and conflict, but in her small sanctuary, she found a silence that was the most eloquent of prayers, a final communion with the land that had welcomed her when no people would. Isabela's journey, which began with a cry for vengeance, ended in a whisper of understanding. She became living proof of a simple and powerful truth: that beneath the different skin colors, the different languages, and the different gods, a common heart beats. The most universal language, the one she saw in Nakia's eyes and felt in her own soul, was not that of war, but that of parental love. This instinct to protect, to nurture, to ensure a future for the next generation was the bridge that could cross the bloodiest abyss. It was the strength that redeemed her, showing that empathy is not a weakness, but the most fundamental and indomitable of human strengths, capable of flourishing, even in the soil most poisoned by hatred. The woman who once knelt in the ashes, consumed by the desire to see her enemy's world burn, transformed into someone who would risk her own life to protect him. She didn't reclaim her lands or rebuild her old life. Instead, she built something much more lasting, a new soul, stripped of facile certainties and adorned with the scars of compassion. Her story isn't about victory in war or the regaining of material possessions. It's about the discovery that the only true possession we have is our own humanity, and that the greatest liberation isn't defeating our enemies, but freeing ourselves from the need to possess them. Isabela's story teaches us that resilience isn't about not falling, but about the strength we find to rise again, transformed by the fall. If this message about love's ability to transcend hate touched your heart, subscribe to the channel so we can explore other journeys of overcoming together, and share this video so more people can be inspired. We'd be honored to hear where you're watching from and what this story has inspired you. Leave your comment, as each perspective enriches our community. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you on the next journey.